Have you ever wondered how someone so gentle, so kind, could one day become unrecognizable, cold, bitter, even cruel? Imagine a devoted parent who suddenly walks away from their family, a loyal friend who turns against you without warning, or a teacher who once inspired others but now spreads fear. What happens in the space between who we were and who we become? Today we explore that quiet transformation, how good people, sometimes slowly, sometimes all at once, turn into something darker, not by fate or by flaw alone, but by a complex unfolding of inner conflict, pressure, and hidden wounds. As Carl Jung once reflected, the brighter the light, the darker the shadow. And often, those who shine the most carry within them an unseen burden. Welcome to this journey of the human soul, a calm but piercing reflection on morality, identity, and the masks we wear. In this episode, we'll look deeper than labels of good or evil and ask, what lies beneath? What is repressed, denied, or hidden in plain sight? And perhaps most importantly, could the same shadow exist within us? Take a breath. Let's begin. We like to believe in the idea of a good person, someone whose heart is untouched by hatred, whose motives are clean, whose conscience never strays. From childhood, we're taught to aim for this image, to be kind, selfless, humble. But what if this image is only a mask? What if the idea of the purely good soul is more myth than reality, a comforting illusion we cling to because it spares us from confronting the complexity of human nature? Friedrich Nietzsche warned us against such illusions. In his work Beyond Good and Evil, he argued that morality is not an absolute truth, but a construction, often shaped by weakness, resentment, and fear. He spoke of slave morality, a system built by those who felt powerless and sought to elevate their suffering into virtue. According to Nietzsche, the person who seems good may simply be someone who has not yet had the power or the freedom to act on their deeper impulses. Their goodness, in other words, is not always a sign of strength or wisdom, but sometimes of constraint, fear, or suppression. And when those restraints are lifted, when power is placed in their hands, or when pressure breaks their moral armor, something long hidden may come forth. Imagine a man who spends his life abiding by the rules, polite, modest, always agreeable, but behind closed doors, he seethes with bitterness, perhaps at a world that never recognized him, perhaps at those who seem freer or bolder. He does not speak these things. He smiles instead. But one day he is given a taste of power or pushed beyond what he can endure. In that moment, his goodness crumbles. What emerges is not a new self, but the parts of him that were always there, buried beneath years of self-denial and pretense. We must be careful then, not to confuse stillness with virtue or quiet with peace. Sometimes the calm exterior a good person conceals a storm. Nietzsche would have us confront this reality, not to become cynical, but to become more honest, more whole. To accept that light and darkness coexist in each of us, and that the most dangerous souls may not be those who roar openly, but those who smile while suppressing the truth of who they are. In the next part, we will explore this hidden side further, the shadow, as Carl Jung called it. Because to truly understand how good people become monstrous, we must look at what lies beneath their light. Every person carries a side of themselves they rarely speak of, impulses they hide, memories they bury, feelings they refuse to acknowledge. This hidden dimension of the psyche is what Carl Jung called the shadow. It is made not of evil alone, but of all the parts of ourselves we push away: anger, envy, pride, fear, even strength we're too afraid to claim. Over time, the shadow deepens, fed by silence and shame, until one day it demands to be seen. Jung believed that the more we repress these parts of ourselves, the more they control us from the dark. Until you make the unconscious conscious, he wrote, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. A person might believe themselves to be entirely peaceful, but within them bruise resentment they've never dared to speak. Or they might see themselves as morally upright, yet secretly feel contempt for others. The tragedy is not in having a shadow, it is in denying its presence. Because when we disown these inner forces, they do not disappear. They grow stronger in silence, often emerging in sudden harmful ways, outbursts of rage, manipulation, cruelty, or despair. The monster we fear in others begins to rise within ourselves, formed by the very things we try to avoid. Think of the devoted caregiver who always says yes, never complains, and swallows every frustration for years. To the outside world, they seem saintly, but inside, their boundaries have been trampled, their needs ignored. Eventually, the tension becomes too much. One day, they snap, not just in anger, but with a kind of coldness that feels unfamiliar even to them. They might say words they regret, or take actions that shock their loved ones. In truth, this moment is not a sudden change. It is the eruption of the shadow, years of hidden emotion crashing to the surface. Jung taught that true maturity comes not from perfection, but from integration. To face the shadow is not to be consumed by it, but to understand it. To look within and say, "This too is part of me." The journey toward wholeness begins when we stop pretending to be purely good and start learning to carry our darkness with care. This honesty does not make us monsters, it makes us human. If this reflection is speaking to something within you, feel free to share your thoughts in the comments, and also like and subscribe if you haven't. This space is for quiet inquiry, not quick answers. In the next part, we'll shift our focus from the internal to the external, how trauma and environment shape the soul, and how even the strongest moral compass can falter when tested by the weight of suffering. A soul does not become monstrous in isolation. Often it is shaped slowly, painfully, by the conditions that surround it. The world presses in, sometimes gently, sometimes with cruelty, and the person begins to bend. Over time, under enough strain, they may no longer recognize who they have become. What we call evil is not always born in malice. It may emerge from suffering, neglect, or the desperate adaptations made in the face of unbearable circumstances. Sigmund Freud spoke of the unconscious as a realm where unresolved trauma quietly distorts the self. When pain is not processed, it is not forgotten, it is buried. But buried pain does not rest. It twists into patterns of fear, defensiveness, or coldness. A child who grows up in a violent home may later lash out at others, not because they are evil, but because violence became their language for safety. Viktor Frankl, who survived the horrors of a Nazi concentration camp, wrote that suffering does not necessarily ennoble a person, it can also destroy them, especially when meaning is lost. In Man's Search for Meaning, Frankl described how even decent people, placed in an environment of brutality and deprivation, could lose their sense of self. The context became the crucible. Consider the story of a gentle young man who dreams of becoming a teacher. He is thoughtful, kind, full of hope. But then war breaks out. He is conscripted, handed a weapon and sent to the front lines. Each day, he witnesses death, betrayal, and fear. To survive, he learns to shut down parts of himself, empathy, sensitivity, even guilt. He returns home, but something in him has changed. He is distant now, harder, unable to feel the way he once did. Was he always this way, or did the world carve a different shape into him? The environment does not excuse cruelty, but it explains how the seeds are sown. When people are starved of love, pushed to the edge, or surrounded by inhumanity, something within them can break. And often, what emerges is not simply evil, it is survival in its most distorted form. It is the soul's way of shielding itself when no gentler path remains. In such states, morality begins to feel like a luxury the wounded can no longer afford. Yet, this descent is not inevitable. There is still a choice, however faint. In the next part, we'll examine what happens when that choice is overwhelmed by power, when the opportunity to dominate or control reveals the darker parts of ourselves. Because sometimes, it is not suffering that corrupts, but the absence of resistance. There is a quiet truth that echoes through history. Power does not always reveal who we are. Sometimes, it unmasks who we have been suppressing. The shift can be subtle. A gentle soul given authority begins to tighten their grip. A humble leader grows impatient with opposition. A compassionate voice becomes indifferent to those without influence. Slowly, the virtue that once defined them begins to erode, not because they were always false, but because power offers a mirror few are prepared to look into. Niccolo Machiavelli understood this with unnerving clarity. In The Prince, he observed that those in power often cannot afford to be good in the ways they once were. Morality, in the realm of politics and control, becomes a luxury or even a liability. But beneath Machiavelli's cold pragmatism lies a deeper warning. Power tempts us not only to act differently, but to believe we are different, to believe we are above the rules that once guided us. And it is this belief, this subtle shift in self-perception, that begins the moral descent. Power does not change all people, but it does amplify what is already within: the desire to be seen, the hunger to control, the fear of losing relevance. Hannah Arendt, in her chilling analysis of Nazi official Adolf Eichmann, described the banality of evil. Eichmann did not seem monstrous. He was ordinary, soft-spoken, bureaucratic, yet he played a key role in organizing unspeakable atrocities. Arendt's point was not that evil is always quiet, but that people in positions of power can commit terrible acts without deep malice, only through obedience, thoughtlessness, or a refusal to reflect. The shift happens not with a roar, but with a shrug. The good person stops asking questions, stops doubting their own certainty, and in that silence, the monstrous can take root. Picture a school principal who begins their career passionate about protecting students. But over time, they become preoccupied with reputation, rules, control. A student misstep, and instead of compassion, the principal chooses punishment, not to guide, but to preserve authority. The same hands that once nurtured now wound, not because the principal is evil, but because the structure, the role, and the temptation of being unquestioned all allow their deeper fears to take command. To be granted power is to be given a test, not of skill but of soul, and many, even the well-intentioned, do not realize they are being tested until it is too late. In our next part, we will turn from the individual to the collective, how society itself can shape monsters not through corruption alone, but through projection, silence, and shared illusions. Because sometimes the darkness does not rise from within one person, but from all of us, together. When a person becomes a monster, we often recoil in horror, as if such darkness could only come from within a single twisted soul. But sometimes the monster is not born alone. It is shaped, silently and steadily, by the culture that surrounds it. The individual becomes the vessel, but the hands that mold it are many: family, community, nation, history. In this way, the monster becomes a mirror, reflecting the values, silences, and desires of the world that made it. Arthur Schopenhauer, with his bleak but honest view of human nature, argued that at our core lies an insatiable will, a blind, restless drive that often cares little for morality or reason. In a society that glorifies success, domination, or image, this will can disguise itself as virtue. Cruelty wears the mask of order. Greed masquerades as ambition, and we applaud those who rise, even if they rise by stepping on others. In such a world, those we label monsters may only be those who were more open, or less ashamed, about embodying what many quietly desired. The horror, then, is not only in the individual, but in the collective reflection they offer. René Girard, a French philosopher, introduced the idea of mimetic desire, the notion that we want what others want, and in that shared desire, conflict arises. To resolve this tension, societies often choose a scapegoat, a figure onto whom all blame is cast. This scapegoat, once isolated, is dehumanized, punished, or even destroyed, not because they are truly guilty, but because the group needs relief. In this way, a person may be turned into a monster not because of who they are, but because of what others need them to represent. The monster becomes a vessel for our denial, a place to bury what we refuse to see in ourselves. Consider the case of a whistleblower who exposes corruption within an institution. At first, they are praised, but as their revelations grow uncomfortable, the admiration turns to resentment. Painted as unstable, bitter, even dangerous. The institution survives by transforming the truth-teller into a threat. The real threat was never the person, but the mirror they held up. Society, unable to face its own reflection, shatters the glass and calls the shards a monster. This is why the stories we tell, the heroes we praise, and the villains we fear matter so deeply. They reveal not just individual choices, but shared values. When we look closely at those we cast out, we often see the parts of ourselves we wish to forget. As we move into our final reflection, we'll ask a quiet but powerful question. If every monster begins as someone like us, then what must we do to remain whole, human, and awake to our own potential for both harm and healing? We began with a question. How do good people turn into monsters? Along the way, we've peeled back layers of the human soul, the illusions we carry about our own goodness, the quiet shadows we suppress, the deep wounds left by trauma and fear, the seduction of power, and the roles that society itself plays in shaping who we become. What we've found is not a single answer, but a truth that lingers just beneath the surface of all our lives. The line between light and dark does not run between people, it runs within each of us. This isn't a reason for despair. In fact, it can be a source of deep wisdom. When we stop pretending that only others fall, we begin to see our own patterns more clearly. We begin to act not out of fear of our darkness, but with care for our wholeness. As Carl Jung taught, healing doesn't come from rejecting the shadow, but from learning to live with it, with honesty, humility, and compassion. And as Viktor Frankl reminds us, even in our struggle, we can find meaning, especially when we choose to remain human in a world that often forgets what that means. So perhaps the real task is not to eliminate the monster, but to recognize it early, within ourselves, within our systems, within our habits of thought, and gently bring it into the light. To remember that every act of cruelty begins with something small, a silence, a moment of denial, a refusal to listen. And every act of redemption begins just as quietly, with awareness, with reflection, with a choice. If you'd like to continue exploring questions like these, you're warmly invited to subscribe and be part of this thoughtful community. Thank you for walking this path with me. May we all move forward with more clarity, more gentleness, and more courage to face both the light and the dark within.